The date was July 20th, 1969, and the United States waited with bated breath as the goal that John F. Kennedy had set for the United States to land on the moon was finally coming to fruition. 650 million people watched Neil Armstrong take his first televised steps on the moon, stating, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Sadly, JFK never got to see his goal realized, as he was killed on November 22nd, 1963. But there's another Kennedy who just 2 days prior to the moon landing made a terrible mistake that effectively ended any future hopes he had for his hand at the presidency. Just 1 year earlier, the Kennedy family had suffered the tragic loss of their son, Robert Kennedy, to yet another assassination. It had been less than 5 years since John had been killed. Their brother, Ted, decided to put together a party to thank the women who worked on Robert's campaign, collectively and affectionately called the Boiler Room Girls. After the party, Ted was driving one of the women home when he suddenly veered his car off a bridge and into a pond. Conspiracy theories have arisen over the years about the Kennedy family and all the tragedy that they had experienced. But what about the mistake that Ted Kennedy made that caused a young woman to lose her life? How can the family of Mary Jo Kopechne move on and grieve over the loss of their beloved daughter? And was the curse of the Kennedy family real? Or did Ted Kennedy make a series of mistakes that resulted in the untimely demise of Mary Jo? This is the story of the Chappaquiddick Incident. I'm your host, Lauren Powers, and you are listening to Not Your History Class podcast. Our standard education has barely touched upon the depth, violence, and tragedy of human history. My intention with this podcast is to illuminate the parts of our history that have been in the dark for far too long. I want to take a comprehensive dive into our world and to give a different and new perspective on our past. After all, education is our strongest weapon against tyranny. Please note, this podcast contains content and information that may not be suitable for children under the age of 13. Please be advised. Mary Jo Kopechne was an only child born in Plymouth, Pennsylvania. She graduated from New Jersey's Caldwell College for Women in 1962 with a degree in business. Her first job after graduating was teaching Black children at a civil rights project in Montgomery, Alabama. In 1963, she started working at Capitol Hill with Florida Senator George Smathers. Soon, she started working on Robert Kennedy's campaign. Smathers had recommended her for the job as she supposedly had an adoration for the Kennedys. Mary Jo was a great worker and quickly became respected in her role for her thoroughness and discretion. Ethel Kennedy, Robert's wife, said, quote, "She was the one who stayed up all night and typed Bobby's speech on Vietnam," end quote. Mary Jo worked with a couple other women in the boiler room of Robert Kennedy's campaign, and they were affectionately referred to as the Boiler Room Girls. She and 3 other ladies rented a small Georgetown house on Olive Street. She didn't have much of a social life, instead preferred to focus on politics. Her friends thought that while she did well in political circles, she was a little naive socially. She didn't drink, smoke, and when she traveled, she liked to call her parents and tell them where she was. A former aide of RFK, Wendell Pigman, said that, quote, "She was the kind of girl who almost scowled at hearing a dirty word," end quote. After Robert Kennedy's assassination, Mary Jo stayed to help Ethel with correspondence. She then went and joined the Southern Political Education and Action Committee, registering Black individuals to vote. She was then hired by Matt Reese Associates that ran campaigns for Democrats in the United States. I had originally hesitated on making it clear that she was helping Black individuals to register to vote and teaching Black students, as at the time I didn't think it was necessary for their race to be mentioned, but it's sometimes difficult to take yourself out of the 21st century mindset and put yourself back into the 20th and 19th century mindset. We have to remind ourselves that while in 1870, the 15th Amendment had been ratified to allow male citizens to vote regardless of their skin color, African Americans have been repeatedly discriminated against to prevent them from using their own rights as citizens to have their own voice. It wasn't until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that was signed into law by Lyndon B. Johnson that was aimed at overcoming legal barriers that prevented Black individuals to exercise their right to vote. I think with that in perspective, it is vital for you as my listener to understand how important Mary Jo Kopechne's work within the civil rights movement was. Robert Kennedy was assassinated within only 5 years of his brother John F. Kennedy. Robert had been elected Democratic senator for New York in 1964. By 1968, he had announced his presidency. He went to California for the primaries, and around midnight, he was notified of his victory in California and headed down to the ballroom to greet his supporters. He was in a crowded hallway when a man stepped in front of him with a .22 caliber revolver. He was shot a few times, and 5 others were injured as well. Rayford Johnson, Olympic gold medalist and Robert's friend, who had also worked on his campaign, had wrestled the gunman to the ground. In a heartbreaking anecdote from busboy Juan Romero, who at the time was a teenager, had sat by Robert's side and comforted him. Quote, "I kneeled down to him and put my hand between the cold concrete and his head, just to make him comfortable. I could feel a steady stream of blood coming through my fingers. I had a rosary in my shirt pocket and I took it out, thinking that he would need it a lot more than me. I wrapped it around his right hand and then they wheeled him away." End quote. Robert Kennedy passed away the next day. His wife, Ethel, was pregnant with their 11th child. Sirhan, who allegedly shot Robert Kennedy, was convicted of first-degree murder. I say allegedly because there are many pieces of evidence that have surfaced over the years, and even Robert Kennedy Jr. is not convinced that Sirhan is guilty. It was the weekend of July 18th, 1969, and Ted Kennedy was hosting a party for the Boiler Room Girls, a group of 6 women who worked on his brother Robert's presidential campaign before his tragic assassination. He, 5 other men, and the 6 women had the party at Martha's Vineyard around the same time as the Edgartown Sailing Regatta. At this time, Ted was married to his first wife, Joan. At around 11 p.m., Ted and one of the Boiler Room girls, Mary Jo Kopechne, got into his Oldsmobile 88. She said that she was feeling ill and asked him to drop her off at her hotel. She supposedly left her purse and her hotel room key behind at the cottage, which cast a question into whether or not they were having a romantic or sexual relationship, even though there was never any evidence of that. Kennedy's testimony later stated that he had made a wrong turn onto unlit, unpaved Dyke Road, crossed Dyke Bridge, which had no guardrail. Tragically, the Oldsmobile missed the ramp and he drove into Poocha Pond. He was able to escape the rapidly sinking car, but Mary Jo wasn't able to. He claimed that he dove 6 times into the water to try and rescue Mary Jo. Unable to reach her, he went back to the party and asked his cousin, Joseph Gargan, and his schoolmate, Paul F. Markham, who served as the United States Attorney for Massachusetts from 1966 to 1969, to come with him to the pond. Gargan, Markham, and Kennedy all returned to the scene of the accident around 12:20, and he said that they took off their clothing and repeatedly dived down to try and get Mary Jo. Gargan apparently made it about halfway into the car. His arm was bloodied and bruised, but he was not successful in saving Mary Jo. The men could not retrieve her, and so they went to the island's ferry slip, where Kennedy decided to jump into the water and swam to Edgartown on Martha's Vineyard. He then went to his room at Shiretown Inn. He changed his clothing and went outside around 2:25 a.m. and spoke to the innkeeper, Russell Peachy. He told Peachy that he had heard a noise that woke him up. It is speculated that he was trying to set up an alibi. The next morning, Ted made a phone call to the police at 9:45 a.m. By this time, Mary Jo's body had already been found. When he spoke to Edgartown Police Chief Dominic Arena, he told him that he had been driving the car. 6 days later, on July 25th, Kennedy pleaded guilty to leaving the scene of the crime. His license was suspended for a year, and he received a 2-month suspended sentence. According to law.cornell.edu, a suspended sentence is an alternative to imprisonment. A judge may rule to give the convicted person a suspended sentence as long as certain conditions are fulfilled. The idea is to help rehabilitate offenders and encourage them to have good behavior. In order for the senator to have been charged with involuntary manslaughter, it would need to be proven that he was doing something illegal, such as driving under the influence or speeding, but no evidence of that was found. Ted denied that he had been drinking and that he was not under the influence and that he and Kopechne were not engaging in immoral activities. But it is strange that he would wait about 10 hours before calling the police, incidentally giving himself plenty of time to let any potential alcohol leave his system. Leslie Leland, the foreman on the grand jury that had investigated the Chappaquiddick incident, said that the judge had refused to subpoena anyone at the party, and investigative documents were not shared, which made it next to impossible to figure out if alcohol had been present in Ted's system at the time of the accident. Leland was experiencing death threats and had been given 24-hour police protection. He said, quote, "Every time there is an anniversary, it's like it happened yesterday. If we had been allowed to do our job, there would have been an indictment and a request to have a jury trial. Justice wasn't served. There were so many indiscrepancies, but we weren't allowed to do our jobs to get to the truth. Whatever the truth may have been, I was young and I believed in the system. I believed everyone played by the same rules. I learned they don't." End quote. In April 1970, the grand jury decided not to indict Kennedy on further charges. Leland had also said of his time at being on the grand jury that, quote, "Essentially, we couldn't do our job. We couldn't get the inquest testimony. We weren't allowed to call witnesses who had testified. The rules had been changed. Yeah, it was a cover-up. I wish the investigative practices used by reporters in Watergate a few years later had been put to work on this case." End quote. Kennedy paid $90,000 to her family, which in today's money would have been more than $750,000. He was investigated for other crimes associated with the Chappaquiddick incident, such as a DUI, but at that point it couldn't have been proven. He took full responsibility and said that he had behaved inappropriately. He was scared, exhausted, and panicked and had a concussion. Ted considered resigning as senator and gave a televised address to the constituents of Massachusetts, asking if he should resign. The public supported him for the most part, and he decided to stay on as senator. But this incident and the death of Mary Jo had irrevocably damaged his political future, and he had an unsuccessful run for presidency in 1980. Since the Kennedys had a great deal of political power and influence in politics, it is speculated that they used that to their advantage to get a reduced sentence for Ted. There's also speculation that if Kopechne's body hadn't been found, he may have never called the police and reported the incident. In his televised statement made to the people of Massachusetts, Ted Kennedy said the following:
"There is no truth whatever, to the widely circulated suspicions of immoral conduct that have been leveled at my behavior and hers regarding that evening. There has never been a private relationship between us of any kind. I know of nothing in Mary Jo's conduct on that or any other occasion. And the same is true of the other girls at that party that would lend any substance to such ugly speculation about their character. nor was I driving under the influence of liquor. A little over 1 mile away, the car that I was driving on an unlit road went off a narrow bridge, which had no guardrails and was built on a left angle to the road. The car overturned in a deep pond and immediately filled with water. I remember thinking as the cold water rushed in around my head that I was for certain drowning. Then water entered my lungs and I actually felt the sensation of drowning. But somehow I struggled to the surface alive. I made immediate and repeated efforts to save Mary Jo by diving into the strong and murky current, but succeeded only in increasing my state of utter exhaustion and alarm. My conduct and conversations during the next several hours, to the extent that I can remember them, make no sense to me at all. Although my doctors informed me that I suffered a cerebral concussion as well as shock, I do not seek to escape responsibility for my actions by placing the blame either on the physical and emotional trauma brought on by the accident or on anyone else. I regard as indefensible the fact that I did not report the accident to the police immediately. Instead of looking directly for a telephone after lying exhausted in the grass for an undetermined time, I walked back to the cottage where the party was being held and requested the help of two friends, my cousin Joseph Gargan and Paul Markham, and directed them to return immediately to the scene with me. This was sometime after midnight, in order to undertake a new effort to dive down and locate Miss Kopechne. Their strenuous efforts, undertaken at some risk to their own lives, also proved futile.
This was only part of his televised statement. If you would like to hear the rest of it, it is available on YouTube or AmericanRhetoric.com. According to an article written by S.J. Robinson and T.D. Higgins, School of Psychology at University of Central Lancashire, England, titled When Disaster Strikes, Human Behavior in Emergency Situations, there are 3 different behaviors that someone can display. The first kind is acting in an appropriate manner, taking prompt and effective action. The second is becoming indecisive and acting in a bewildered manner. The third type of person will display maladaptive behavior. They might cry, act confused, have hysteria, or may experiencing paralyzing anxiety. It seems that in this instance, Ted had acted appropriately by diving back into the water several times. In the FBI vault during Ted Kennedy's testimonial, this is what he said about the incident and what he remembered from it. Quote, "Well, I remembered the vehicle itself just beginning to go off the Dyke Bridge, and the next thing I recall is the movement of Mary Jo next to me, the struggling, perhaps hitting or kicking me, and I, at this time, opened my eyes and realized I was upside down, that the water was crashing in on me, that it was pitch black. I knew that, and I was able to get half a gulp, I would say, of air before I became completely immersed in the water. I realized that Mary Jo and I had to get out of the car. I can remember reaching down to try and get the doorknob of the car and lifting the door handle and pressing against the door and it not moving. I can remember reaching what I thought was down, which was really up, to where I thought the window was and feeling along the side to see if the window was open. And the window was closed. And I can remember the last sensation of being completely out of air and inhaling what must have been half a lungful of water and assuming that I was going to drown, and the full realization that no one was going to be looking for us that night until the next morning, and that I wasn't going to get out of that car alive. And then somehow I can remember coming up to the last energy of just pushing, pressing, and coming up to the surface." End quote. In his testimony, Ted also said that when he finally got out of the car, which he doesn't remember how he did, he was swept by a current about 30 to 40 feet and managed to wade out of the pond to his waist before diving back in to save Mary Jo. He reported that he was fully aware of what he was doing, that he was trying to rescue Mary Jo, and that his head and neck were aching from the accident. He said he was breathless, exhausted, but he was not confused. In his testimony, Ted shared that he had a lot of regret about what happened to Mary Jo, but his testimony continued to be all about how he was going to find it difficult to deal with this situation and report to his mother, to his wife, to his father. In his testimony, did he rarely ever express the regret that her family would have to face in dealing with the very preventable and tragic loss of their daughter. Ted had considered running for president in 1972, but due to the Chappaquiddick Incident overshadowing his career, he decided against doing so and instead supported Democratic Representative George McGovern. Ted did run for president in 1980, but did not win the primary and lost to Jimmy Carter, which is seen as embarrassing as Jimmy Carter was pretty unpopular. Ronald Reagan won that year. Kopechne's family has done their best to honor her memory, including telling her story and awarding scholarships to students. Her cousin, William Nelson, who was born 3 years after she died, said, quote, "We've shifted into trying to have Mary Jo's life mean something. She was kind of glossed over as the girl in the car. It was all about Ted Kennedy. She would have gone on to do great things." End quote. She was committed to civil rights, which is originally what drew her to Robert Kennedy's campaign. Nelson also said, quote, "Mary Jo was ahead of her time for women in 1969, so I'm pretty sure that she would have pioneered a new path for women in Washington. The true tragedy of that night in Chappaquiddick is she never got that chance." End quote. Patrick Maney, a Kennedy expert and professor of political science at Boston College, said, quote, "The phenomenon of the personal becoming political began with Chappaquiddick. There was something different in American politics after Chappaquiddick than there was before." End quote. In 2017, there was a film about this incident titled Chappaquiddick, starring Jason Clarke, Ed Helms, and Kate Mara. I read this on the Smithsonian Magazine and felt that it perfectly encapsulated the feeling I had while researching the story. The screenwriters Taylor Allen and Andrew Logan felt that this story was showing the perfectly disposability of women and the abuse of power, as well as the media representation in hiding or exposing political scandal. They based their screenplay on the 1,000-page inquest by the Massachusetts Supreme Court in 1970. John Curran, the director of Chappaquiddick, said, quote, "The two people who really know what happened that night are dead, Ted and Mary Jo, and others around them, the ones that are still alive. They aren't going to say anything." End quote. Mary Jo's mother, Gwen Kopechne, said, quote, "Sometimes I'd like to scream a lot, but I'm trying to hold it back. It would be nice if someone spoke up." End quote. What she doesn't understand is how come Joseph Gargan and Paul F. Markham hadn't called the police. Quote, "Gargan and Markham not only failed to get immediate help, but also let the senator swim back alone to report the accident from Edgartown. This is the big hurt, the nightmare we have to live with for the rest of our lives, that Mary Jo was left in the water for 9 hours. She didn't belong there." End quote. For those who are wondering why this event didn't get more coverage, or maybe you have never even heard of it, there's a very simple explanation for that. On May 25th, 1961, John F. Kennedy made a national goal to send a manned spaceship to the lunar surface and return to Earth. Sadly, JFK did not get to see this goal fulfilled, and on July 16, 1969, Apollo 11 launched from Cape Kennedy, carrying Command Module pilot Michael Collins, Commander Neil Armstrong, and Lunar Module pilot Edwin Buzz Aldrin. On July 20th, 2 days after the tragic drowning of Mary Jo Kopechne, Apollo 11 landed on the lunar surface. About 650 million people watched Armstrong's first televised steps on the moon. This was a huge deal, not just for humanity, but it effectively allowed for the U.S. to win the space race that started between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Not only that, but less than a month later, on August 8th through 9th, the horrendous and grisly murders of actress Sharon Tate and 4 others were committed by a group of people, collectively known as the Manson family. The Manson family were the followers of the charismatic and terrifying cult leader, Charles Manson. This does not mean that the Chappaquiddick Incident was ignored or forgotten. It wasn't just the Kopechne family that was affected. Joan Kennedy, Ted's wife at the time, was pregnant and suffered a miscarriage, which she blamed on the stress of the incident. Despite her own grief losing her baby, she stood beside Ted and said that she believed him. There were many theories bouncing around that there may have been misconduct between the Boiler Girls and the married men at the party. Susan Tannenbaum, one of the women there that night, said, quote, "You can't begin to understand what it's been like. I place a tremendous value on the right of privacy, but suddenly I'm infamous. The real meaning of what you are and what you value remains intact inside of yourself. But there you are, splashed all over the papers. How would you feel if a reporter called your mother at 8 a.m. and asked whether she approved of her daughter's conduct in spending the night with a group of married men?" End quote. In his memoir, True Compass, Ted Kennedy called the incident as, quote, "a horrible tragedy that haunts me every day of my life." End quote. Despite this horrific event and the consequences on Ted's future bid for presidency, it didn't seem to derail him that much. Over the course of his life, he was elected to 8 terms as a U.S. Senator and served from 1962 until he passed away in 2009. There have been several conspiracy theories over the years, including that Mary Jo was already deceased and the accident was an attempt to hide her death. Had an autopsy been performed on her body, there may have been answers to the question that this tragic accident had caused to arise. Her family decided not to go through with an autopsy, and they also did not bring personal liability lawsuits against Ted Kennedy. They believed that suing would result in what they considered to be blood money. There's also a theory that due to the Kennedys' affluence, money, and influence in politics may have been the reason that the Kopechne family did not pursue any legal avenues. The investigation was halted, though, as the Kopechne family refused to have her body exhumed. To his dying day, Ted maintained that he was not driving drunk and that it was a wrong turn with a poorly lit bridge. Donald Nelson, a retired research physicist who used to work at Bell Laboratories, wrote a new book called Chappaquiddick Tragedy, Kennedy's Second Passenger Revealed. Nelson believes that there was a second passenger that night, and his book names Rosemary Cricket Keogh as his front seat passenger, and theorizes that Mary Jo Kopechne was sleeping in the back seat, unbeknownst to both of them. Keogh was one of the boiler room operatives that had also worked with Mary Jo on Robert Kennedy's campaign. Nelson has done thousands of hours of research on the Chappaquiddick incident. He studied the inquest and the grand jury documents, and his conclusion was that Kennedy and Rosemary had freed themselves that night, walked away from the scene, and did not report the incident because they did not know that Mary Jo was asleep in the back seat. He believes that Kennedy's explanation of repeatedly jumping back into the pond to rescue Mary Jo was a lie to conceal that he did not know that she was in the back seat. There was a poor investigative practices done by Edgartown Police Chief Dominic Arena and a lack of follow-up by Edward Dennis, the district attorney who was assigned to the case. Nelson said of Kennedy's lies that, quote, "his crime was not related to the accident. He didn't know Mary Jo was in the car. His crime was the cover-up, the lies he told," end quote. Dominic Arena received a lot of criticism for his handling of the incident. An Edgartown volunteer fire department scuba diver named John Ferrer had helped free Mary Jo's body from the car, and in his inquest he said that the forensic evidence at the scene supposedly showed Kopechne dying from suffocation rather than injuries or dying from drowning. But remember, there was no autopsy done on her body, so that could not be absolutely confirmed. Farrer also reported that the positioning of her body suggested that she had remained alive for an amount of time after the car went underwater, but the amount of time is undetermined. The car was upside down, and so her face was pushed into the footwell and her hands were gripping the back of the front seat. It looked as though she was trying to push her head into a pocket of air. Catherine DeWitt Jr., author of Chappaquiddick, The Real Story, wrote that due to the cold temperature of the water and the fact that the car was upside down, it was unlikely that Mary Jo was able to survive for an extended period of time. An inquest released by Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court in 1970 said that there wasn't any evidence as far as any air remaining in the submerged car. However, it did not allow any testimony about how long she may have lived as, quote, "this could only be conjecture and purely speculative," end quote. Kennedy wrote in his memoir, True Compass, that, quote, "My burden is nothing compared to Kopechne's loss and the suffering her family had to endure. She also didn't deserve to be linked to me in a romantic way. She deserved better than that," end quote. If you are looking for sources for this episode, please check out our show notes. Transcripts and sources will also be on my website, notyourhistoryclass.com. Researching, hosting, and production and editing is all done by Lauren Powers. Theme song and episode music is done by Mike Myers. You can find him at the Mike Show 42 on X. If you have any recommendations or suggestions for a future episode, you can direct message me via social media or email me at notyourhistoryclass@gmail.com.